Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's presentation, 5 Ways to Raise Your Game with HR Automation. This event is part of SHRM's webcast series. You can learn about upcoming and on-demand programs from our e-newsletters and the webcast homepage at shrm.org/webcast. SHRM thanks today's program sponsor, Sage, for helping make this webcast available to the HR community. Today's program will examine the vital role automation plays in transitioning an organization away from transactional HR. You'll hear how to make the business case for automation and 5 key outcomes you can achieve by embracing an automation strategy. To lead our program, we are pleased to welcome Paul Buren from Sage Business Cloud People. Paul Buren is a Vice President at Sage Business Cloud People. He is a work trends expert and a self-proclaimed people geek. At Sage Business Cloud People, Mr. Buren runs a global cloud HR and people system that helps organizations around the world to acquire, retain, manage, and engage their workforce. With introductions complete, I'm pleased now to turn over the webcast microphone to our speaker, Mr. Paul Buren.
Thanks, Mike, and hello, everybody. Good to be with you today on the webcast. Essentially, the webinar is really going to focus on 3 main sections. The first, we're going to look at the changing world of work and provide a little context as to what are some of the key things that HR is having to deal with in modern business, the demands that this places on HR, and how automation can help. So that's one chunk. Then we'll move into looking at 5 ways automation can help raise our game, given all these competing demands. And then finally, we'll look at some of the benefits and the business value that automation can offer by looking at some customer examples and some aggregated ways you can look at providing sort of business outcomes, if you will. So let's begin by really just looking at the world of work. And as we all know, the world of work is continuing to change. And the consequence of that is that we're living really in quite exciting times. So we all know through our consumer activities, we're all global, we're on demand, you can get access to all sorts of information, and we're all 24/7 consumers now if we want to be. And business is very much like that. Work is no longer a place we go, but it's a thing we do. And we've seen that mobile computing and the availability of the internet has really changed how we think about and consider work. But there's also a whole range of other factors that have changed here. The workforce itself continues to change. It's global or multi-locational. It's very diverse, often being multicultural, up to 5 different generations in the workforce, different genders, people having multiple aspirations and lots of different skills which they want to hone and take advantage of and also develop. Work styles are also continuing to change. We're all quite familiar with flexible working and remote working. But what's interesting now is the rise of the so-called contingent workforce and the gig economy, because all of these things is creating the need to think about the workforce differently. So if we think that 30 to 50% of the workforce could be freelancers or contractors over the next 5 years, that gives some idea as to just how much of a scale this is. And what's interesting is if you look at Deloitte's 2018 Global HCM survey, 50% of the 11,000 respondents are using a significant number of contractors in the workforce, and 13% of these are effectively gig workers. So there is an expectation among executives, C-level executives in particular, that flexible workers, contingent workers, and project-based workers will increasingly take over a significant amount of work currently being done by full-time employees. So this is really a fundamental shift in work styles and the nature of the workforce. Then, if that wasn't enough to worry about, there's also the global skills crisis and the ongoing war for talent, driven by ongoing technology changes and the growth of the digital economy. And if you ask C-suite executives and look at some of the research here, up to 90% of these execs have said that they expect talent competition to increase even more in the years ahead. So the skills crisis, the war for talent, is obviously going to be an ongoing challenge. Then there is the huge issue regarding the lack of engagement in most businesses and the impact this is having on performance and the ability to hire and retain talent. And if that wasn't enough, there's also compliance requirements, new compliance requirements from Europe and also here in the States with California's upcoming Consumer Privacy Act. So all of these factors are combining to make companies rethink how they attract, recruit, manage, and develop their workforce. Now, if we look at this in the context of some of the top business objectives that HR teams are faced with, and this is derived from Gartner, and you can see here, although it's a little busy as a slide, there are really 5 key things that are outlined here. Growth, improving operational excellence, transforming business, which relates back to the rise of the digital economy, ongoing innovation, and cost optimization. Now, the reason for just outlining these very quickly is that each one of these also has implications for HR. So not only do we have all this changing world of work that we just touched on, but we're now looking at these key business objectives, and we can see that these also have implications for how we think about solving some of the problems. So, for example, if we look at growth, then this would have implications potentially about ongoing talent acquisition, the ability to find and recruit top talent and getting them up to speed and contributing as quickly as possible as they go through an onboarding process. If we look at improving operations, then this could be all about finding better ways of doing things. How do we improve processes? Maybe even think about redesigning some of the processes, and this will include HR processes. So that's interesting because this suggests that there's an opportunity for HR not just to be thinking about existing processes, but thinking about redesigning. So HR become design agents, if you will, in terms of finding better ways of doing things. Transforming businesses enables HR to think about how can we adapt new technologies to improve business functions and think about different types of automation. And likewise with innovation, we can be thinking about not only contributing, designing new ways of working, but also looking at new approaches to solving business problems, whilst at the same time using automation to think, how do we become more efficient and effective as part of the business, and how can we drive down associated costs? So the reason for talking through these is just to touch on some of the wider context in which automation has a part to play in helping achieve these goals. Now, when you look at all that and say, well, okay, that's fine, so what is it that HR leaders actually need in amongst all of this? What are the fundamentals? Well, if you stop and think about it, the fundamentals really don't change. So the sorts of things that HR has to do today are pretty similar to what HR has had to do for a while. We have to find ways of acquiring the best talent and onboarding that talent quickly. We need to provide accurate and up-to-date information and potentially actionable insights about the workforce to the business. We need to be able to provide the business to undertake performance reviews, to develop talent. In this day and age, we also need to be able to help businesses become recognized as great places to work so that they can not only retain their current high performers, but also attract new talent to the business. And of course, you have to ensure that the business remains compliant with employment regulations. So all of that doesn't change. But what has changed is the way we go about these tasks. And let me just give you a few examples to make the point. So we know that there are now very different ways of doing things and that many HR processes are fundamentally changing. For example, annual performance reviews are giving way to the notion of continuous conversations with social recognition and peer shout-outs. And so much more ongoing interaction and engagement between managers and their teams. There's also the recognition that employee experience management is fundamental to improving engagement and productivity, as well as the need to understand the employee life cycle and the whole employment journey. So a much more holistic approach to managing people. And then there's also the importance of things like employer branding. And this becomes critical when you think that 55% of job seekers can abandon their application after reading negative reviews. So this becomes a critical consideration. And then things like employee and alumni social sharing also becomes critical. Interestingly, something like 64% of candidates will share negative job application experiences with their networks. And clearly, if you're trying to recruit people, that's not really a very helpful thing to have happen to you. So all of these things have profound implications for automation and HR systems. Now, if you think back, many existing HCM systems are transactional and are designed to automate traditional HR processes. Newer systems provide HR with the means to bridge the old world with the new. So this means things like how can they help you automate both traditional HR processes, but also some of these new HR processes, some of the new ways we do things. How do these systems also not only help HR, but also help managers, leaders, coaches, and others across the business get the best out of their people through things like employee or workforce experience management? And what's more, how can these newer systems really ensure they're providing you with a holistic approach in automating the entire employee life cycle, and that they are flexible and are able to grow and change as you do? So what we're going to do is hand back to Mike now for a few minutes to just have a quick look at this from your point of view and to undertake a short poll regarding some of the processes that you're currently automating. Mike, back to you.
We would like you to select all that apply to you in terms of what processes you currently automate: talent acquisition, onboarding, employee self-service, absence management, HR analytics, succession planning, talent management, or employee workforce experience. So it looks like for our live program, at least, these results may shift a little for folks watching on demand, but for our live program, employee self-service is the clear leader, with nearly 3/4 of the folks watching indicating that they have automated that process. Also, onboarding and team acquisition are reported by at least half of our viewers. Kind of nearby is absence management. We've got about 1/3 who've automated that process, and smaller percentages for the remaining choices: HR analytics, talent management, employee workforce experience, and succession planning. Mr. Burren?
Thanks, Mike. And thank you all for participating. The results are really quite interesting. One would expect talent acquisition to be reasonably high because clearly many companies are trying to find and acquire people, so that's perhaps not too surprising. And it's also, if you're acquiring and bringing on new talent, onboarding is often the critical part of that. I think the employee self-service I thought was really interesting that it was as high as it is, because different research suggests that can sometimes be more variable. And I'll come on to the analytics part of this. This is much lower. I'll talk more to that point a little bit later because that's also quite an indicative and revealing result in its own way. As I say, we'll touch on that in just a bit more detail in a little while. So thank you for that. Let's think then, as we move forward with this conversation, as how is it that automation can help? Well, McKinsey estimates that 60% of all occupations have 30% of activities that could be automated. So automation can be the key to unlocking productivity and business potential. It can also help you streamline many manual administrative tasks, which can help you improve productivity and efficiency within your teams and departments. Modern automation can also go further than that, though. It can also help you deliver really great workforce experiences and empower employees through self-service, as many of you are doing, but also through better communications. It can also provide businesses with much better workforce visibility, and it can provide actionable insights for managers and leaders. Interestingly, with the analytics result we saw, only 14% in the return on this suggested that that's what you were doing. So it's an interesting result, as I said earlier, and we'll talk more to that a little bit later. And finally, automation can also help ensure compliance while reducing costs and the risk of human error. So think about this overall approach. Imagine if you could free up 30% more time to focus on engaging with employees and creating more business value rather than perhaps dealing with the duller sort of back office administration that so often happens. So having set the scene, let's move forward and look a little bit now at 5 different ways that you can raise your game with automation. And we'll provide some examples which can help you improve productivity, provide actionable insights to your business, and also deliver some better experiences for your employees in your organizations. Now note that these are not the only ways you can improve things with automation. They're just some examples that we thought would be quite useful to consider. So let's start by looking at onboarding experiences. Many of you indicated that you're already doing that, and therefore you'll be aware just how important onboarding is. Up to 20% of employee turnover happens in the first 45 days of people joining companies. So clearly, if a joining experience isn't good, then it's going to contribute to that problem. What's interesting, though, is that today many companies still fail to personalize the candidate experience throughout the recruiting process and the onboarding process, with many of them leaving new hires with a serious concern about understanding what their boss expects from them, followed by worries about learning how to perform their job. And interestingly, surveys suggest that up to a third of newcomers to businesses felt that their onboarding, only a third felt their onboarding gave them the tools and resources they needed to actually address some of these challenges. So what are some of the problems that happen around onboarding? Well, often onboarding is disconnected from the hiring and selection process. New employees can take too long to ramp and add business value quickly. The experience, as we've seen, can be very inconsistent, and so new employees can be left confused as to their role and what is required of them. And as a consequence of these, this can lead to some of the challenges that we just touched upon. So how can automation help? Well, it can help companies and managers stay more connected to employees from the point of hire to their first day, ensuring that they're engaged and excited about actually joining the business. It can also help provide accurate employee details with no manual input from HR, such as rekeying basic resume or CV data into systems. So rather than having to take information from the ATS system and then rekey it into your HR system, if you've got it fully automated end-to-end, that's done automatically as the candidate becomes an employee. Other ways to automation can help. It can give new hires easy access to a suite of helpful resources, ensuring they feel confident and motivated before they start work. And it can also enable new employees to understand policies and complete any mandatory training as early as possible, sometimes known as pre-boarding in some businesses. So if you get this right, it's really beneficial. 69% of employees say they're more likely to stay with a company for 3 years or more if they experience great onboarding. Organizations with standard onboarding processes experience 50% greater new hire productivity and also much higher employee engagement. So there's some very real benefits of getting the onboarding experiences right, and automation can clearly play a key part in that. Now, a second way you can raise your game is through engaging and motivating the workforce. Now, what's interesting here is that research has shown for some while that relatively small numbers of employees are actually engaged in their jobs. The most recent research that I've seen by Gallup suggests that only 15% of employees worldwide are actively engaged in their jobs. And we know from other research that millennials are twice as likely as so-called baby boomers and Gen X to disengage at work. Now, as millennials now comprise 50% of the US workforce and soon will form 75% of the global workforce, this is really a serious concern for businesses. So what are some of the challenges that exist here? Well, challenges vary, but some examples include things like information overload. Employees do not know what is important or where to find critical business information. People can feel disconnected from the business because of ineffective or infrequent communication from leadership. And sometimes employees just don't know how to get things done around here. Where do I go to get help, or how do I escalate issues or problems that I have quickly? So how can automation help with a modern HR and people system? Well, first of all, automation can help streamline communications and use next-generation apps to help employees find the latest and most critical information. And this can be key to actually really streamlining and getting them up to speed quickly on what matters the most. Furthermore, it enables either executive leaders or team leaders to really help the business, help employees understand and focus on the things that matter most. So what's the most important thing that employees need to know about this week or this month, either from the CEO's office or from perhaps the CHRO's office? which you really want to get across to the organization. Furthermore, automation can help business leaders connect with their teams and keep focused on what matters most. It can provide links and access to the most important files, frequently asked questions, and the like, whilst providing the ability to use pulse surveys to get regular feedback or immediate action, so that not only can you keep people motivated, but you've also got that feedback loop so you know where some of the issues are and where some of the concerns are so they can be quickly addressed. Finally, automation can really help enable flexible and other work styles, empowering employees by focusing performance on outcomes rather than just being in the office or being busy. So some of the potential benefits of doing this are really quite critical and quite interesting in their own right. Some research that Sage has actually done shows that positive workforce experience has a huge impact on productivity, according to 78% of the respondents. And this actually jumps to 92% for younger generations. So in other words, positive work experiences are really critical to getting a motivated, engaged, and productive workforce. Interestingly, highly engaged teams show 21% greater profitability than teams which are not engaged. And that's another key part of this, is that this is not just about people being happy. People can be happy doing nothing. What you really want is people being happy but motivated and engaged so that they're in a position to do their best work. 50% of workers advocate that automating their busy work is absolutely crucial, and 97% said their brains work better and they're smarter and more efficient when they're engaged in new and challenging work. So this all speaks to the importance of really being able to use automation to help get rid of some of the drudgery, and so that we can keep people focused on things that they find interesting and really helps drive motivation. So the third of our 5 factors here to consider around ways we can raise our game is around flexible performance management. Now, performance management is an issue for many businesses and has been for some while. Only 8% of companies believe that their performance management process is highly effective in driving business value. And up to 58% say it's actually not an effective use of time, which is really quite worrying, considering this is clearly supposed to be one of the most important ways of making sure that people are actually getting things done that the business needs to get done. What's also fascinating is that something like 45% of HR leaders do not think annual performance reviews are an accurate appraisal for the employee's work, and employees would tend to agree with them, because research by Gallup suggests that only 22% of the employees agree their performance is managed in a way that motivates them. So clearly, the ability to deal with performance management in a better way is really critical, and nearly 80% of executives rate this as being a high priority. So what are some of the challenges here, and how can automation help? Well, we know that in many cases, existing performance management processes are time-consuming and relatively ineffective. Managers are often not providing employees with the coaching and the feedback that they feel they need in a timely manner, and employees are often left feeling unrecognized, undervalued, and demotivated. What's more, many managers are not often equipped to actually provide and manage some of the performance reviews effectively, and as a result, businesses often come away not really knowing if they are truly paying for performance. So how can automation help in this context? Well, as we all have gathered, companies of all sizes are shifting away from annual appraisals to more regular check-ins and frequent real-time feedback. And so businesses are now opting for continuous performance management software over more traditional appraisal software. Because what you're trying to do is to create better ways of appraising performance, better for employees and better for the business. Automation can also help instill a culture of continuous conversations. It can help with enabling peers to recognize instantly contributions that their colleagues have made. Social shout-outs and the means of celebrating success and celebrating each other's achievements are additional ways where performance management can be more effective and also help drive motivation and engagement. Providing on-the-spot rewards for colleagues so they feel valued for the contribution they have made can also be another way of getting much more out of people, because the rewards, they're seeing the rewards for what they've done, and so it all ties together to be more impactful and effective. Automation can also help companies understand performance across the business, identifying top talent, helping develop career paths for high performers, and really making a significant difference in terms of getting the overall return on investment that they're looking for. So the potential benefits of going down this approach could be the redesign of performance management, which is now this high priority that we talked about earlier. 89% of HR leaders agree that ongoing peer feedback and check-ins are key for successful outcomes, which is helping reinforce the need for new systems and new ways of automating these processes. And 90% of companies that have redesigned performance management see direct improvements in engagement. So clearly, the shift to these alternative approaches and becoming much more flexible about performance management is working. But the key issue here is to ensure that the systems that you have are able to automate and help take advantage of these new ways of looking at performance, rather than just being able to automate the more traditional approaches, which are now being questioned as to how effective they are. Two more to go. If we look now at the fourth, this is all around empowerment and how we can empower employees through self-service, which is something that many of you look as though you're already embarked upon, which is very encouraging, because it suggests that the importance of self-service and the importance in terms of US workers expecting their employee to provide a high level of employee self-service is a critical part of the employee experience. What's interesting is that research, both by other companies and including Sage in this, suggests that self-service as a standard is actually much lower than we saw in the results in our poll. Typically, it's of the order of about 24%. So very often, companies want to do or provide self-service, but are not typically doing so that effectively. What's more, people that are working in fully enabled digital workplaces see a much more positive impact on productivity, and 70% have cited it also helps improve collaboration. So this is really important, that we're providing not just the right automation and the right technologies for our employees, but we're doing this in the right way so that we're really helping them empower what they do through the ability to do it for themselves, rather than having to put more workload onto already stretched HR teams and asking them to do it. Now, if we look at some of the challenges that exist here, then very often we see, particularly in smaller organizations, we see that HR is often buried under a deluge of requests. And if you think about what that means, then that means that every time there's some sort of change asked or change required, then what happens? We find that, well, the change goes back to HR, and HR are the ones that have to do all of these changes. So this is one of the real problems. Many HR teams are buried under really quite boring administrative tasks, making all these changes, when quite frankly, if we had automated systems, employees could do it for themselves. But there are also other related problems that happen with this. Many times, records are out of date. So employee information is inconsistent, and the business could possibly be out of compliance with employment regulations as a result. It also means that when reports are produced or when business leaders ask for information, then that information that's provided is often out of date or is inaccurate, because the records haven't been updated quickly enough to reflect the actual real state of the business and the workforce. Furthermore, employees can become very frustrated with the inability to access and manage their personal data, book holidays or book absences, or find salary-related information or benefits information. And this all results in poor experiences. So these are real challenges for businesses. How can automation help with some of these problems? Well, first and foremost, it can simply reduce the number of HR requests. So this frees up time for HR teams to focus on either more valuable interactions with the business and do things like, strategic planning, or getting more involved in working with the business and spending time with employees and adding much more value in what they're doing rather than having to be bogged down with low value, boring administrative tasks. It also means that the business is able to maintain accurate and up-to-date employee details, which typically should be stored in one accessible and secure location. Now that's really critical because this then provides not only accurate information, but it also means that when it comes to doing things like reporting and analytics, the information that is being used is accurate, it's up to date, it's current, as opposed to reflecting things that have happened in the past and are now out of date, and therefore the reports are far less valuable and meaningful. Other benefits of automation in this context can be enabling the quick identification and contact details of colleagues across the business and in other regions. It can help empower employees to view their pay information or manage their leave requests and access policies so they feel in control of what they want to be able to do. And also it enables managers to approve leave requests and manage absences more efficiently and effectively. So all of these things empowers employees and managers to do things themselves with ideally an automated, but also it should be a consumer-like and intuitive system, which will also help improve their workforce experiences while lightening the administrative load for HR. So the last example we'll use around how automation can help us raise our game is really around analytics and considering actionable insights or providing actionable insights for the business and enabling managers and enabling the business to actually make people decisions based on either data or good, accurate information, so that the decisions are really based on solid facts rather than perhaps gut feeling or just ad hoc information. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about this area, this whole actionable insights and analytics, and this was reflected in the poll earlier, is that if you ask people about how important is it to be able to provide data-driven decisions around your employees, so who are the best performers in the business and therefore deserve to get perhaps the best pay awards or bonuses, or who are the people that are your high performers that you need to think about in terms of fast tracking with career paths or the equivalent, then when you do that sort of research, typically you'll find that large numbers of people surveyed will agree with you. So some of the research that Sage has done in this context indicated that 83% of those surveyed said people decisions should be based on data and analytics. But then when you say, well, okay, so we all agree that we should be doing it, but how many of us are doing it? Then only 37% of those surveyed were actually making people decisions based on data. And come back to the poll, it looks like it's an area that really hasn't been automated that effectively, at least in the context of this audience participating in this webinar. So this all suggests that intentions are good, but the reality is very different. And what's more, we know from research that 92% of HR leaders are struggling to actually gain strategic insights from people data. So you'd think this would be a priority, and yet research from Gartner suggests it's only a priority for about 33% of HR leaders and HR teams. So somehow we've got this little bit of a sort of contradiction. It's really important, we all agree it's important, but we're not doing that much about it. So why are there so many challenges? Well, challenges here can exist in terms of employee information being scattered across multiple systems and locations. So that can make it really difficult to do accurate reporting without more sophisticated tools, such as the ability to put in business intelligence tools and bring data together in one place or into one warehouse perhaps, or data mart, where you're actually able to bring all this information together and then report on it. It can also provide inconsistent, incomplete, and inaccurate records. So this can create all sorts of issues in the business, from providing contradictory information to different managers and different teams and to the management team and to the board, and also creating possible compliance risks. It can also be a problem because HR is unable to provide the business with accurate people information. So what then happens is that people don't trust the information that's being provided. HR then ends up in a somewhat difficult position. And what happens is that we get back to everybody relying on gut feel and ad hoc information to actually make decisions about the workforce, which is clearly suboptimal. So how can automation help in this situation? Well, first of all, it can provide a single system of record for all your employee data. So this means it will be accurate, consistent, and reliable. It enables you to provide real-time reports and dashboards immediately and make this available across the business. So now people aren't having to wait for you to provide reports. You can provide the right people with the right information at the right time, and they can do it on demand. You also have the ability to create forward-looking views and actionable insights for leadership. So whilst reporting is necessary, as we all know, reporting tends to give you a backward-looking view of the business. And more often than not, what executives are looking for is, well, that's all very nice, but it's looking forwards that's the key issue. And how do we actually provide more useful information for leaders to make better decisions when they're trying to plan for the future? And finally, automation can really help because it can free up HR teams from being stuck in spreadsheets the whole time, something that we've heard referred to as spreadsheet hell, where you're spending all your time just sort of buried in spreadsheets and information trying to create reports, and as soon as you got one report out, you're on to the next one, and it's just never ending. The other thing that's interesting around this is the potential value that automation can provide, because it enables you to start thinking about, well, which metrics should I track and what are some of the KPIs that are necessary, and this will vary because there's so many of them that could be used, but it depends on the questions you're trying to answer. It can also help, determine, if you get a particular metric. So, for example, if you say, well, I've got a 25% voluntary turnover. Well, is that high? What should your target be? So you can do things like benchmarking. You can also do things like measuring and predicting the quality of hires, or potentially getting ahead and looking at things like, problems with things like the potential flight risk that may exist in the business and where that may lie, and how you can predict it, and more critically, what you might be able to do about it. So let's move on then to the final part of the webinar, where I really just want to look at a couple of customer examples of ours to give you a little bit of a feel of some specific instances, and then we'll go on to look at some aggregate benefits that we put together that you can use when you're starting to think a little bit about how you can apply automation and make the business case, and then we'll wrap for questions. So here's one example: Worldwide Clinical Trials, which is one of our customers. It's Worldwide Clinical Trials is a U.S. headquartered business. It has 1,700 employees. They're in the pharma and healthcare sector. What's one of the fascinating things about this company is that they're a small business, but just see how distributed they are. They've got employees all over the world. They are in 60 different countries. So for a small business, that's a lot of countries. And they use one global system across these 60 different countries, this one system of record, one source of truth for all their people. And so from all of that, they're able to get accurate reporting. They can remain compliant because there are strict regulations in the pharma sector that they have to meet. And over and above that, one of the big benefits they saw, as you can see here, is they were able to obtain a 20% initial reduction in the HR admin workload. So that was just an initial reduction. And obviously, as you start to think about using the systems to automate additional processes, you would expect to see that grow. So that's one example. A second one is actually from across the Atlantic. This is a company that's headquartered in the UK. Again, they're quite distributed. They're a little bigger, 4,400 employees. They're a software business. They now use a single global HR and people management system across 40 different offices, 40 different locations. And they've seen a couple of really interesting benefits. One, they've reduced the time taken in managing salary reviews by 50%. So clearly that's a pretty significant improvement in its own right. But another very interesting situation that they were able to solve, were they able to reduce attrition by 5%. Now this was really quite interesting because before they had this system, they first of all weren't fully aware of some of the attrition problems that they face, because it's obviously, if you only have information based in countries and that information is based on spreadsheets or you're in multiple locations, then it can be quite difficult to keep on top of it. But they were able to find through looking at the data that they actually had different types of attrition problems in different locations. And by looking into that in more detail, they were able to get to root cause and to come up with policies to address it. So in one situation, they had an attrition problem in parts of Asia, and the problem was found to be a situation where they were recruiting a lot of younger people into the business. There was a lot of competition for those people, and so just as they were able to find somebody and attract them to the business and just get them started, then a competitor down the road would be able to offer a better opportunity, an increase in salary, and so of course they were seeing people come and go very, very quickly. Well, without being aware as to exactly the nature of that problem, it's very hard for them to actually put the right policies in place to deal with it. A second challenge that they had in a different location actually turned to be more around a slightly older part of their workforce, and it was to do with retirement-related challenges. So really quite interesting is that as you look into data and you can use data more effectively, so you can identify root causes of problems more effectively and be in a position to address them and get on top of things. So let's move to the penultimate slide. We've talked about a number of benefits of HR automation. This is an example of when we can see how you can aggregate benefits from a number of different customers to get a sort of high-level view. And you can see here, this is just a few key points. But one is, well, what's the sort of benefits that a number of customers could see over time to sort of give an aggregate view of companies. And these are typically smaller businesses. So you can see over a period of 3 years, this sort of aggregate view suggests that almost 2 million of benefits in terms of dollars can be attained through HR automation. And this can be really helpful in terms of helping making business cases around investing, why you could do this sort of thing. A second key thing around this is the ability to implement quickly, because if you can implement the systems fast, then obviously you get people using them quickly. So not only do you want to implement them quickly, but you want a very high rate of use across the business, then you will be able to generate an ROI from automation that is really demonstrable and really quick, so the business sees a fast return. And the other thing you want out of it is obviously, not only to get that fast return, but as part and parcel of that, get people using the system because it can be up and running fast. So these are all ways and means of getting some of the benefits out of automation. Other things to appreciate is that processes and systems are changing. And so as you think about automation, think about, are you looking at contemporary HR systems, or are you looking at systems which really perhaps may no longer be fit for purpose for the modern world in which we're having to automate? Recognize that automation is part of a journey and that change is part of a journey. We're witnessing the transformation of HR at the moment from this transactional, process-centric world, which has been perhaps somewhat more internally focused, to a new type of function, a new profession, which is much more focused on employees and people, finding, hiring, retaining, and getting the best out of the workforce. And also, finally, there are new types of automation now emerging to help us become even more effective in supporting the business. So technologies such as augmented intelligence, machine learning, and artificial intelligence really hold the promise of improving automation. And we're starting to see some of this where we are getting new types of automation capability, particularly in things like recruitment. So examples would be intelligent screening, or the use of chatbots as recruiting assistants, or perhaps the use of new tools to help try to avoid bias in the interview process and the selection process. So lots of new tools coming down the line, lots of new ways of thinking about automation. But all in all, just making you think a little bit in terms of just some of the approaches and benefits that you can get through automation and how we can collectively raise our game. So this really concludes the key points that I wanted to cover. Please take this opportunity to download the supporting ebook, which covers some of the points that we've had a chance to touch on here and now. I hope you found it really useful and that this has helped you get a slightly broader understanding perhaps as to how HR automation is changing with new HR and people systems like Sage People as an example. And with that, I'm now going to hand back to Mike Frost for questions.
Thank you, and we'll turn to audience questions in just a moment. It's not too late to get them in. Sherm, thanks. Sage for sponsoring this program and SHRM's series of free webcasts for the HR community. Sage Business Cloud People enables mid-sized multinational companies to manage workforces through its global cloud HR and people system, transforming how organizations acquire, engage, manage, and develop their employees. Implemented quickly and simple to use, the award-winning system increases workforce visibility, HR productivity, and provides better experiences across the entire workforce. For more information, please visit sagepeople.com. Okay, let's turn now to questions. And we'll start here. An audience member asks if you have suggestions for getting managers on board with animation. The viewer writes, often I face resistance to learning even more software. The other challenge is selling this to leadership and executives. Manual processes are working well, they say, and are free. Sometimes it's hard to sell the investment when you can demonstrate the improvements to empowerment. Even then, the need for self-service, efficiency, and accuracy. Any pointers you can provide?
Yeah, these are really good points, and it can be difficult. And I think HR in particular has suffered, probably more so than almost any other part of the business, in the sense that because we can use manual processes and have used manual processes, and the simple fact that there's always other competing problems in the business, and therefore, if you're in finance and you need some sort of new tool, finance is more likely to get investment, or sales is more likely to get investment, and HR is always the poor relation in all of this. However, what is interesting that we found with our customers is one of a couple of things. Either the business gets to a point where suddenly the problems are becoming really critical. Now, in some situations that can be around compliance, but more often than not, what we found is that when a business either gets to a point where the information that's being provided to managers is just so contradictory that they're getting really frustrated, and it's like, no, we're getting to a point where something has really got to change here, or they're getting in situations where the business itself cannot grow, for example. Growth is a really good example. What we've seen with customers is there was a situation, for example, where a customer was looking to grow through acquisition, and therefore they were looking to grow through acquiring another business. To do that, they actually had to be in a position where they could state exactly, that the size of their workforce and where their people were and some other related data, because part and parcel of this whole growth strategy was based on accurate data. Anyway, to cut a long story short, one of the problems that they had was they couldn't do it. They couldn't figure out exactly what some of these key data points were, and the consequence of that, believe it or not, was the acquisition failed simply because they couldn't get the right information together in the right time to effect the transaction to happen. So I think there can be situations where you can talk to managers, or the business does get to a point where they recognize that they simply have to do something, and that carrying on as they are is just not going to be good enough. But I do recognize that it's not easy, and that in many cases, particularly with smaller businesses, companies are often unwilling or sometimes just unable to invest in the way they need to. So all you can do, I think, is see where the biggest problem is, try and make the case as best you can, and use other examples around you where you can find them to demonstrate the benefits that automation can bring.
Turn to some of the specific areas you discussed in the presentation today on onboarding. Audience member asks, you mentioned onboarding as the first of the 5 ways to automate. Do you recommend it as a starting point for automation, or are there other places that would make sense?
Again, it varies by company. One of the things, again, I'll speak from the experience of working with customers. Typically, we sell to companies which are smaller businesses, so that's typically companies which are between 200 and 5,000 employees, typically in industries where people are crucial to the success of the business. So examples would be the tech sector, or business services, financial services, not-for-profit organizations, these types of businesses. Now, one of the things that we normally run into is that they simply don't have accurate information Their employee data is all over the place. It could be in spreadsheets, it could be in files, in emails, goodness knows what. And the single biggest problem they usually have is how do we get all this information in one place, and how do we actually get into a position where we can start driving accurate reporting for management teams and for the board and others. So many cases what we see is that onboarding isn't the initial point they start with in the case of our customers. It's normally around how do we get this sort of single system of record, how do we do reporting and analytics and use that more effectively to get a better understanding of our workforce. How do we do that through using self-service as part and parcel of it? And then once they got that, because we have an end-to-end solution, we can then basically work with customers to figure out, well, what's the next biggest problem that you have? Now, more often than not, with smaller companies, they're trying to grow quickly, so things like talent acquisition and onboarding will often be probably the next thing, and certainly a high thing in terms of importance, and will usually be one of the next processes that gets attention from an automation perspective. However, having said that, that's not always the case. Other companies may be wanting to focus on performance. Other companies may want to be using it more in terms of looking forward from a planning point of view. But the beauty of this approach is if you're using the right types of systems, then you can actually determine, where's your biggest pain point and where do you need to put the biggest effort now to get the biggest return for your company. And it's that flexibility that's necessary. The other thing that I would also say is that given the changes that we talked about right at the beginning of the webinar, there are so many different changes happening. And again, for almost every business, as we shift through these different types of technologies and the shift to the so-called digital economy continues, what we're really seeing here is the need for ongoing flexibility. So the notion that everything can be sort of prescribed and we know exactly when changes are going to happen and we can plan for all of that has largely gone. And as we all know, things happen very quickly, businesses have to respond fast, and therefore when you're thinking about automation, the other thing that's really crucial is how do you make sure that the systems that you're bringing in to help you are going to also enable you to remain flexible and adaptable, and sometimes the term agile is used, so being able to respond quickly and adapt fast to change. So I don't think onboarding itself is necessarily the starting point for everything, but for many companies it will certainly be an important consideration, as we saw in the poll results.
All right, continuing with questions on self-service audits, who were asked, how do you drive employees to use the self-service portal?
Now this is, I think, a really interesting point, because when we start thinking about portals and self-service, if you look at very traditional HR applications, normally self-service is pretty awful, the portals are not very good, and quite frankly, employees don't use them on a regular basis. They just use them as infrequently as possible and only when they have to. With modern systems, what's changing is that the interfaces are much, much more consumer-like. There's much more information. It's not just about HR data, but it's also providing content. It's providing the means to find out more about others in the company through collaboration, through org charts, but org charts which provide information about people. You can get access to policies. You can obviously also book time off. You can do your reviews and everything else through there in terms of performance reviews. So as you start seeing these more contemporary systems, this is what I mean by an HR and people system. The HR bit deals with all the fundamental HR table stakes, the core processes, the things you would expect a basic HR system to be able to do. But the people part of it is really about how do we provide better content and communications and information, data, things that are going to make employees want to come and use it because it's inherently valuable. It's where they go to get things that they can't find easily elsewhere. It's where they go to actually find out, what really matters in the business, because the CEO or the HR leader or other leaders in the business are providing that core contextual information to the business in this way. And the reason that that's so important is that so many times, either we've seen the problems we talked about earlier with information overload, and/or we've seen situations where employees quickly, they've either got too much information or they don't know what information is the most important. Both of those can lead to serious disengagement. Modern systems can help solve those problems, And this is what we mean in the context of this sort of HR and people system, and this is where employee self-service becomes so relevant, because if you can do this and you can provide access through all sorts of different types of screens, laptops and mobile devices and all the rest of it, you've now got an inherently more valuable solution, and it's one that employees will want to engage with, and it therefore helps HR provide a much better ROI on the investment.
And we'll close with this question. Audience member asks, who do you normally see within an organization as being part of the automation implementation team? Is this usually led by HRIS or someone else?
It depends on the organizations. So HR will often be interested in an HR system, but it can depend on the broader problems. I mean, IT will obviously get involved. You'll have systems implementers that will get involved. Sometimes the HR solution can be part of a bigger automation process that's going on, and therefore you may find that it's not just HR, but you could have finance or others involved as well. Perhaps it's more of a business management solution that they're looking for, where it might be HR and payroll and maybe finance, so it's a little bit more complex. So it can be variable, but you'll normally have implementation teams that will get involved with key people inside the company in order to help with the automation process. And of course, then that's one part of it, but then you want to make sure that people are actually, not only can get to it quickly because it's been implemented fast and it's providing value, but also that you're getting high usage across the workforce. Typically you'll want 80 to 90% adoption within a week or two of the system going live if it's going to be seen to be a success.
All right, thank you. With that question and answer, we are going to bring today's webcast to a close. Before we sign off, a couple of final thanks. First to our presenter today, Paul Burin from Sage Business Cloud People. Thank you for the insight you shared. And we want to thank our audience for joining in today and for choosing SHRM for HR webcasts. That concludes today's program.